Hi, I'm Ken Jacobson, Senior Documentary Programmer, AFI Festivals. Welcome to AFI Fest 2020 and to the AFI Summit presented by Audi and to today's session, Doc Roundtable, moderated by Caroline Libresco. Today's session will be 90 minutes long, and time permitting, we will be taking a few of your questions at the end, so please do put your questions in the chat. First, I want to thank our supporters of the festival, our presenting sponsor, Audi, our AFI members, and of course, you, our audience. I also want to thank all of our panelists for participating today and Caroline for moderating. Our moderator, Caroline Libresco, just wrapped 19 years as one of the head programmers of the Sundance Film Festival. During her tenure there, she built Sundance Catalyst, which in its first 6 years under her direction raised more than $31 million for 90 projects. She was also founding director of the Sundance Women's Program. Caroline is a documentary film producer in her own right. She executive produced Disclosure and produced Peabody Award-winning American Revolutionary, The Evolution of Grace Lee Boggs, and Tribeca Jury Prize winner, Sunset Story. Thanks again, Caroline, for moderating today's panel. And now please take it away.
Wow, 8 completely extraordinary films. In watching these films this past week and rewatching some of them, I was bowled over by the boldness and the urgency and the artistry and also the deep humanism that courses throughout this whole collection. Gripping and powerful, to put it mildly. And I think all of these movies speak to our political, social, and cultural moment. Before going any further, I'd really like to introduce all of our panelists. If I could ask you to put your cameras on, I'd love to just point you out and have you say hello very briefly. As soon as you wave, we're going to go right into a question. So just say hi. Right now, this is in alphabetical order. Ramona Diaz, 1,000 Cuts, currently in theaters and slated to be on Frontline in January 2021. David France with Welcome to Chechnya, currently on HBO for the last couple of months. Liz Garbus, All In, The Fight for Democracy, currently on Amazon since September. Ron Howard, Rebuilding Paradise, currently on National Geographic for the last couple of months. Kirsten Johnson, Dick Johnson is Dead, currently on Netflix for the last 2 weeks, since October 2nd. Bao Win, Be Water, your film is currently on ESPN. Dawn Porter, The Way I See It, and I believe this movie is not premiering till tomorrow night on MSNBC, correct?
Last night.
Last night. Okay, great, fantastic. I thought that was true, and then I read my notes, which said the 18th, and I was like, wait, it's the 16th. But yes, you premiered last night, and we'll talk all about that. And then Elise Steinberg from The Fight, currently on Hulu for the last couple of months. So, wow. This is a big group of 8 people. So I thought about how can we make this meaningful for the audience and in general, how can we connect and coalesce all of these disparate films, which aren't so disparate, it turns out. So my goal here is to reveal and explore the singularity, of course, of each of your films, but also to make use of the critical mass in this incredible Zoom call, to give us maybe a big picture, like to connect the dots, hopefully for the audience, or maybe the audience can connect their own dots about the documentary form right now. Like, where are we? What is going on? What's the role of the filmmaker in this heightened moment? And also to think about the audience and this notion that I learned from great Lynette Walworth of Australia, this idea of the audience completing the work. I'm really interested in that, in the audience completing the work, because I know that you all think about that a lot, knowing your work. So I want to explore that too. So just, and welcome to all of you, old friends and new. It's beautiful to see you here. And I'm going to start with a question to the whole group, kind of a beginning, a foundational question, because my thought is that the audience may not know, may not have seen all of these films. So I just want to start there with just establishing what these movies are. So if you could just go around and say what your film is about, say the name of your film, obviously what it's about, and then how was this project born? And you can interpret that however you want. How did the material reach you? Why did you want to make it? How was it born? Okay, so what's your film about? How was it born? If you don't mind, go around.
Alphabetically or?
Oh, good idea. Sure, let's go alphabetically. Ramona, go.
Okay. So the name of the film is 1,000 Cuts, and 1,000 Cuts is about press freedom, the rise of authoritarianism and disinformation as told through the story and the experiences of Maria Ressa. It's life unfolding in front of the lens, but it also tells the story of the other characters in the film, who are close allies of President Duterte in the Philippines. I came to this story because, I was born and raised under martial law. I was, and that was under the Marcos dictatorship. And for some 40 years later, President Duterte becomes, president in the Philippines, and he starts the drug war. And the drug war is dark. And the drug war is like a hark back to very, very awful times in the country. So that's why I was drawn back to go back to the Philippines to tell the story. And when I got on the ground in 2017, I realized that a lot of people were drawn to the same story, and why not, right? It's a good story. But I think I wanted to pull out a little bit from the drug war and look at the systems that enable President Duterte. And I looked around, and there was Maria Ressa. Maria Ressa is a world-renowned journalist, and she was talking about the drug war. She was questioning the numbers of dead because there are something like more than 20,000, according to human rights groups. And not only that, she was also connecting it to impunity, authoritarianism, and disinformation. So she was making that connection and the intersectionality between all those things, right? So I thought, wow, I'd never heard that, and she does it so well. She unpacks it so well. So I decided to really slowly, she became the center of gravity of the film, just because when we started filming her, she also started getting arrested by the government, and she started really being the target of President Duterte. So that's what drew me initially, is because it was troubling, and then it grew from there.
David, you're next. France.
Hi, thanks.
Hi.
So good to be here, and with all this incredible talent on this stage.
I know.
Welcome to Chechnya is a story about hideous crimes against humanity in the Republic of Chechnya, which is in the south of Russia. It's a campaign to round up and exterminate the entire LGBTQ population in the Republic. It's if that sounds like Nazi Germany, it's in fact the first time since Nazi Germany that anything like this has taken place. A government down directed campaign against the queer Chechens in a way that I was horrified by when I first read about in early 2017. I think a lot of people were. Headlines ricocheted around the globe that this was happening and that it had been revealed. And then it all kind of slid from the headlines. And I guess in my comfort zone of complacency, I felt that it had taken care of itself, or the European outcry of disbelief and horror around this had somehow stopped it. But it turns out that that wasn't enough, and that even that was too meager to give any sense of solace or hope to the people inside Russia. And that then I learned over the summer from a piece of journalism in the New Yorker that LGBTQ activists on the ground in Russia had been left to take matters into their own hands. And that's what shocked me even further. Like, how had this kind of media dereliction and political dereliction been allowed to happen? And what are the circumstances of the community there in Russia, of human rights community, the social justice community, the LGBTQ community, what are they doing in the absence of international support? That's why I began on the story. As some of you may know, I have a couple of films now where I have examined radical queer activism, and that's certainly was hinted to me that that's what I was going to find here. And what I found was that indeed, and so much more. So that's the film. I spent 18 months embedded in the network of the activists as they were doing this incredibly heroic work of rescuing people and getting them to safety.
Fantastic. Liz, all in the fight for democracy.
Yeah, so far I think we have a theme of democracy or lack thereof, right? And that brings us to the United States. The question was how the film came to me, and there's two answers, both of which are true. One is that, one of the things I think I did a lot of reading and thinking about was in the discussion after the 2016 election, and people bemoaning the lower voter turnout and talking about why Black and brown communities and young people had not turned out for Hillary Clinton, as if somehow they just were not, they didn't care or they were not moved. The discussion was taking place in a vacuum, not acknowledging the assault on voting rights that had been happening, really ever since the passage of the VRA, but really the crackdown with the 2013 Shelby versus Holder decision, in which, as voter registration went up, polling places, went down, ID laws, all of those things. So, but that wasn't a very sexy idea. It was just something I talked and thought about and thought, well, there's something we need to do, but I don't know what it is. And then in 2018, I got a call from Stacey Abrams about making a film on voter suppression. She, as you guys all know, had run for governor in Georgia and the first Black woman to be on the Democratic, leading her party for governor in the Democratic ticket for governor. And as I'm sure everybody knows, she fought a very hard battle running against the Secretary of State, who is both her opponent and the ref of the election. So it's like if you're in a soccer game and then the opposite team is also the ref, you have a real hard time trusting that result. So in any case, those two things came together. Stacey was very clear she didn't want this to be the Stacey Abrams story, not out of some kind of false humbleness, because humble is not in her vocabulary. She is a powerhouse, but because once you make about one candidate, one story, it's you can write it off. You can say that's Georgia, that's the South. Oh, that's Stacey. She's but to look at it in the long tail of American history. And when we started looking at it that way, what we realized was we had and I made this film with Lisa Cortez, my fellow filmmaker, who sadly is not with us today, but we realized what we were making was a monster movie. And it was a monster movie about American history in which every time, the forces of good assemble to slay the monster, and you think you've kind of say it's safe to swim around in the water, the monster comes back with a different face. And if it's not a billy club, it's a strict ID law that disenfranchises. So that's a little bit about our origin story.
Ron, will you talk about Rebuilding Paradise?
Sure. Well, and we might get into this later. First, I'm the rookie here. So I've worked around a lot of films slowly but surely. I've always been interested in documentaries and journalism. Done a lot of scripted movies based on real events. I always enjoy the research and so forth. Always sort of tentative about getting into it. Remind me later, I'll talk about sort of how I finally took the leap because it's a nod to somebody I really respect and appreciate. But so made a couple of films that were, it was very clear what the narrative was going to be. They were, stories of 8 days a week about the Beatles, Pavarotti, his life. And certainly there were surprises through the research and discoveries in the interviews and revelations that I found really interesting. But I keep finding I can put a lot of myself, more of myself into these films than I necessarily even expected that I could. And I really enjoy it. But I've never done verite. I've never done a film where you don't know what the outcome's going to be.
Yeah.
And with the people who run the Imagine documentary group, Justin Wilkes and Sarah Bernstein, I was saying, I'm really enjoying this. I want to be a little more ambitious about it, and I'd like to find a subject. Didn't really know what it was. I have a lot of relatives living in Northern California, from my wife Cheryl's side of the family. They're very close to us. In Redding, we have a lot of family. They had a horrible fire the month before. That was called the Carr Fire. They were not displaced, but they were terrified, and I was certainly aware of it. Then Paradise, this little town of Paradise, gets hit. It's about an hour and 15 minutes from Redding. Well, I've spent time in Paradise because my mother-in-law lived the last, 4 years or so of her life there. So I'd been to Paradise and I recognized what this town was. And I just intuitively, naturally now I had a deeper emotional investment. And we see these horror shows, these nightmarish things, and we feel whatever we feel, empathy, or you can't be bothered or whatever you feel, but you go on with your life more or less. And so, but this stayed with me because it's 95% destroyed. And I just kept thinking, can they come back? How do you come back? And the other thing that was clearly in my mind from the beginning, and my film was not a polemic. It's not investigative journalism at all. But I did, from spending time there, from having relatives and loved ones in the area, I just know very well, this is like the seat of the spirit of self-reliance. These are this pioneer spirit. That's the code. And from just being around some, disastrous circumstances or watching great films about Hurricane Katrina or other disasters, I knew what these people were facing was really, they couldn't make it alone. And I was curious how they would cope, what they would try to do. And I went to Sarah and Justin. I said, is this a subject? Should we do it? And it was sort of in my mind, rebuilding Paradise with a question mark. And they said, only one way to find out, send a team. How quickly can you get there? A camera went. And I went a couple days later. And within, a couple of visits, and a sizzle reel and so forth, Nat Geo said that they would commit to basically, embedding there as much as we could. Right. And that was the whole plan. That was it. It was just, Liz was talking about, her film she recognized was a horror film. I always do that with mine. When I did one behind the scenes about Jay-Z's music festival, in my mind, that was Nashville. Right. The Beatles was Das Boot. They're in a bubble. Who knows? Everything's going on. It's crazy. They just have themselves. Pavarotti, it's straightforward story. But this was our town to me. And I just wondered, what it was going to be. And thankfully, the people were very giving, and they believed that as it ceased to be a news story, that we would actually stay. And we did, thanks to Nat Geo's support and Zan Parker, a producer, Liz Morheim, another producer, who, when I couldn't be there, were coming and going, constantly.
And I want to pick up on that idea of like more than a news story, more behind, after the news cameras go away. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay. Kirsten Johnson, Dick Johnson is dead. Tell us just, what is this movie about and how is it born for you?
First, I want to say, Ron, welcome to the documentary community.
Thank you.
Fun.
Thank you.
And we're into not knowing.
Well, I discovered that. All right.
We're into it. We're into the unexpected. And I just want to salute my fellow filmmakers, many of whom I love really deeply. Like when I watch your films, the risk that you take, the like sort of existential fight that is in your films is so powerful, including with Bruce Lee, like his fight with his body to be seen and to exist in this world. And so, I think of cinema as like this possibility, right? Like we can reach through the screen and get in there. And like, here's my dad, he's like a piece of cardboard right now. My dad has dementia. I started making this film when I thought he didn't have it, but the origin came from many places, but one of which was something that like cinema has taught me, right? Is that cinema is time travel. Cinema sometimes keeps people alive for us. You know, in some ways, like, Ron, you're still a child for us forever, right? And the way in which cinema can sort of hang on to someone, I learned from the great editor I work with, Nels Bangerter, with my first, film, looking back at my own life and footage, where he put a shot of my mom's ashes next to a shot of her alive. And the first time I saw it, I was like, I really thought she was alive. And so suddenly I was like, wait, maybe cinema can keep my dad alive forever. And so I knew this was a doomed project. And yet I knew that I'd worked on a lot of projects where I had been all over the world, seen people fight for their lives, seen people survive violence, racism, poverty. And sometimes some of those people are the funniest people you'll ever meet. And after years of working on deeply serious films, I was like, I really want to make a funny documentary. So that was also the quest of Dick Johnson is Dead.
And it is delightful and also very poignant and painful too.
I love that KJ's idea of comedy is her father's impending death.
Hey, I'm a documentarian.
That tells you all you need to know about this community.
For a good time.
I'm really, Bao, you're next. I know this movie is also really personal in many ways for you. Your film about Bruce Lee, Be Water. So tell us about it and how it was born.
Well, thank you all for having me, and it's such an honor and quite humbled to be part of this really amazing panel. So yeah, Be Water is a film about Bruce Lee, but it's looking at Bruce Lee beyond the myth of Bruce Lee, looking at him beyond the icon. And I think for the longest time, people just think of Bruce Lee as this martial arts icon, as a film star, but they don't really know him as a person. So I wanted to sort of unpack that myth in many ways, and not just unpack the myth of Bruce Lee, but also unpack the myth of America. This film was personal in many ways. I'm not related to Bruce Lee in any way, but my parents were Vietnamese war refugees, and they were in a Hong Kong refugee camp. So they came over to America, much like Bruce Lee did, with very little money in their pocket and really no connection. So that was the way that I tried to put a bit of my personal story in it, and really talk about his journey as an immigrant American, which I think is lost in the narrative of this story. I'd also say just kind of the conception of the project came about 5 years ago, but I think it's been a project that I've kind of wanted to know I wanted to do in the back of my mind for a long time. I wasn't the hugest Bruce Lee fan growing up, but I just remember never seeing, people who looked like me on screen, Asian Americans. And if they were on screen, they were usually playing the villain or the sidekick or the comic relief. So when I saw Bruce Lee on, television, I was just amazed that there was value in our stories as Asian Americans. We can play the hero. And I think that's indicative of kind of the films that I wanted to make, especially with Be Water, because, there's this Dominican American writer, Juno Diaz, who said something that was always in the back of my mind when I was making this film, is that there's this idea that monsters, they don't have a reflection in the mirror. So if you want to make a human being into a monster, you deny them their reflection on a cultural level. And that, for me, has been how I view cinema and culture in many ways. And so Bruce Lee, to me, is more than the icon. He's so much more. And I think we can talk about it more later.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. That's an incredible idea. And then Dawn, okay, so last night, the premiere on MSNBC of The Way I See It. Just give the audience a sense of what this movie is and how you became involved and how it happened.
Sure. The way I see it is a movie chronicling President Obama's White House chief photographer, Pete Sousa, who spent 8 years in the Obama White House, but he also spent several years in the Reagan White House. And you know, your job as a photographer, it's interesting, Val, your words about reflection and then KJ about permanence of cinema and how we remember. And so Pete took 1.9 million photos while he was the White House photographer. But he does this one-man show, which really is to have people remember with visual evidence, what it is like to have a compassionate, empathetic, hardworking leader. So, you know, he who shall not be named is rarely named, but the contrast is quite evident. So the film is really actually about leadership and compassion and what unites us, rather than what divides us. So premiered on MSNBC last night, but it's a Focus Features movie. Just had a great kind of universal feeling, like everyone was watching together last night, which was, you know, really cool in this time. So,
you know, I want to just pop in and say that literally every single one of your films made me cry. I don't know if it's the political moment. I'm like at the end of my rope, and I'm, you know, my emotions are raw on the surface, but literally, because so much is at stake in every single one of your films, so much, whether it's as personal as the loss of our parent, or seeing ourselves on screen, Bao, or voting rights, or the office of the president, or the environment, or the justice for gays and anyone on the margins, to, you know, democracy itself with Ramona, and for Elyse to, you know, to give us an intro about the fight, but you know, your film, the reason why it always makes me cry to think about the ACLU is it almost feels like the ACLU is somehow it's like the ACLU is the only thing between me and the end of democracy sometimes, at least in the last 4 years. So talk about your film, give us a sense of it.
Sure. Thank you. And I just want to say it's like tingly and a little intimidating with you guys all. But it's also just hearing you guys talk is like, it's very energizing, just because we all know what it means to like make these films. And also I just, Caroline was really instrumental in helping this film come to be. I did the Sundance Women's and then Sundance Catalyst, and you gave me a lot of support to make this film a reality. So, okay, so this film follows a team of ACLU lawyers for 3 years as they battled the Trump administration and follow some of the civil rights big cases. And it came about because it was, you know, if you remember, it's like a haze of everything that's going on, but it was 7 days after Trump enacted his Muslim ban. I joined the protesters that were gathering on the steps of the Brooklyn courthouse. I'm like, it's right, it's not far from my house. And I was there and I saw the ACLU attorney Lee Gallant emerge from the steps of the Brooklyn courthouse, having won that victory. And it felt just like Caroline said, it felt for me like, oh my God, will our democracy, like what is going to happen? And to have this little ACLU lawyer standing up against the Goliath of our government, it just felt like, okay, like this is a big battle. And these little Davids are fighting and they're going to be in this fight. And I just felt like, okay, this is where I want to be. Verite is what I love. I want to be with these ACLU lawyers for the next 3 years. Hopefully they'll let us in. I know they're lawyers. My mother was also a litigator who fought for immigrant rights. So I think I've always wanted and been interested in doing this. And this has been a little bit of like, there's a familiarity. In the film, we're with these lawyers. There are about 5 of them, 4 cases that we follow. That's it. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, good. I want to switch now to a little bit about sort of getting into the creative process a bit before we zoom back out and look at sort of your films in the world and how you want them to function in the world. But so before we do that, I really want to get into like you as artists and how you work with the material that comes to you or that you go after or that is just, in many of these films, it feels like these were exactly the right films for you, for each of you at that moment. Like there was no question. It was just, you had to make these movies. But specifically, I wanted to look at the relationships to your characters and your collaborations. In the case of The Way I See It and All In and Be Water, your collaborations actually with your characters. And Dick Johnson, of course, the collaboration, but then also, but to begin, I would like to talk with Ramona and David about your subjects and you know, you guys you dropped into the worlds of subjects who are literally fighting for, you know, at great risk, at massive physical risk, for things they want to, that they believe in the face of governments who are literally murdering the citizens these people are trying to protect. Tell us about the danger and how you established trust with these characters, and how you protected them, and what your presence there did, and how that interaction ultimately shaped the story. Does that, I know that's a big question, but
no, it's that's a really good question, and many questions. So let me so yeah. So with so the main character, you know, it turns out of the film, as it turned out, is Maria Ressa of 1,000 Cuts, and I actually did not know her, but I knew of her. And actually we have this sort of origin story as well, because like 14 years ago, I was in the Philippines and she requested an interview with me and I turned her down, and she was the face of CNN then, but it's a long story. I was in the Philippines because the first Imelda Marcos, who was the subject of my first film, was suing me in the Philippines. So I went there to defend the film, and she wanted to interview me, and I turned her down. Yeah. And then so 14 years later, I'm in her office asking to film her. And I was hoping, oh my God, I hope she doesn't remember. But of course, she looked at me, she goes, you know, I've always wondered why you turned me down. I said, I turned you down because you didn't like the film. And I didn't want to talk about I didn't want the sense. Anyway, so that's how I started my relationship with Maria Ressa.
Great way to start, right?
Yeah, I'm like, oh my God. But to her, you know, to her credit, she said, you know, then we have time to talk about it now. I said, okay, I guess. I said, is that a yes? But, you know, like with everything, right? I mean, you earn their trust slowly, right? The access is slow, it's ongoing. And I think even the most media savvy person, as I've found, they don't always know why their story's worth that sort of unflinching gaze of the lens, right? They don't always buy into it, but they turn a corner at some point in the process and understand it. And then they're with you all the way. And then they're what I call, like, they become embedded producers, because they tell you what's happening in their lives. And that's where you want to get them. But of course, with Maria, it was different, because she was then getting arrested and getting detained and if you ask her why she let me in, she says, you know, I wanted to record it. As a journalist, she wanted to record it and they couldn't do it themselves. So she goes, why not Ramona? You know, let her come in. But little did she know that I really wanted, more than what was happening to her publicly, I wanted to, like, move into her apartment. You know, of course, you don't tell that to people, but really that's what you hope. And that was slowly revealed. And I think at some point she understood that, and it's trust, right? At the end of the day, it's trust, and you form this bond. And I think and the resulting film is really a result of that relationship, of the of your relationship to the protagonist. It was interesting to me the other day. I was talking to a bunch of journalism students, and one of their questions was, are you friends with everyone you film? And I'm like, should I not be? Because I'm not a trained journalist, right? I'm a filmmaker. And I said, yes, of course, because I spent so much time with them. You you do become friends. I'm not sure, and because for journalism, that's not a good thing. Not a good thing, but it's not necessarily a good thing. But so that's, I think, the difference between what I guess we do and what journalism does. We stay forever, and we film behavior. I always say I film behavior. That's what I do, and I film attitude, and that's what's different from journalism. So that's how the relationship started, and I think our presence in her life also served as a light on what was happening to her. So in a way, it was it prevented President Duterte from even going after her even more because of the attention that she was getting. She believed that to be so. I wasn't sure in the beginning. I'm like, oh, but she said, no, the attention's good. International attention's good. And I want him to see us, like I want him to see you filming. But President Duterte knew we were filming because we had to ask permission from his people anyway to film him closely at the rallies. So he was very well aware. And I think our visibility also saved us. I was also, of course, concerned about our local crew, and that was a conversation that I had to have with them and make it very clear that if they needed to, because your risk tolerance is a very personal thing, right?
Sure.
And that's a personal decision. So I said, if you feel like you can't stay, I know you're local, we leave and you stay, you can walk out now and I'll be totally fine with it. I'll totally understand. And no one did, Caroline. Everyone stayed, and they said it was the right story to tell. It was so touching, and and so at some point you just embrace the danger, right? What are you gonna do? Not do it? I think I'll lose. I mean, I'll forever regret not doing it. And there was no question. I had to do it. Yeah.
I know that so much of what you said is resonating with David France right now. Although it's a very different world and circumstance. I know, David, talk about your presence with your characters. It probably wasn't as positive as Ramona's. It didn't protect them as much.
But as Ramona says, and I think everybody's surprised by this, once you get your toe through the door, you do stay forever. And I think if we told people that, we might have a harder time getting through the door on the first knock.
Yeah.
But I talked earlier about the lack of news media around this catastrophe in Chechnya, and when I made my first contacts with the people there, I discovered that one of the reasons for that was that people were very, very afraid of doing anything that would reveal where they were and who they were and would draw fire. That this was literally a hunt. And so I reached out to the folks who first were running the shelter system, and I said, I'd like to tell your story. And they said, well, like, how could you? Like, is this going to even be possible? Can you get into the shelter system safely without endangering us? Can you get out of the shelter system with footage that you have under control enough so that if it ever got lost, it wouldn't endanger us? And then once you get into the shelter system, how are you going to convince people who have been through such terrible torture and dislocation and such horror to the point where they're being hunted down by their own government with the aiding and abetting of their own family members? How are you going to convince them to that you can tell their stories without endangering them? So it began this conversation on many levels with all the different stakeholders, I guess. Each person in the film had a different aim, a lot of it very personal. And so that was the beginning of a long conversation with people. I made more difficult by the fact that I had no experience reporting in Russia.
Yeah.
I didn't understand the language, which I think did help me a little bit in the filming, because I just disappeared. I was the guy who didn't speak.
The mute guy.
The mute guy in the corner. So they would walk past me. It wasn't until I transcribed the footage where I noticed that they would be talking about me all the time. I was the quiet guy, they would say, stuff like that. But anyway, so it was really a matter of saying to people, and I think this is really for the first time in my career that I've had to do this, and I come to filmmaking from investigative print journalism, that I say to people, I'm going to work with you on this disguise thing. Like if you let me sit here and see what you're experiencing and take this journey with you, and let me know the emotional truths of your journey, and let you reclaim your voice to narrate your own history, then I will safeguard that footage in ways that were very complicated and expensive, and I will come back to you over and over and over and over again to make sure that you are comfortable. And we talked early on in the process about consent versus informed consent. It was easy enough for me to get people to say yes. No, I mean, probably 4 out of 10 folks that I approached said yes. So I had a good quantity of characters that I could follow, but I was concerned that they had just left a dungeon. They had escaped with their lives. They had been fleeing through the night. I see them on their first day. Does that yes hold? And so we made a commitment to return to them over and over and over for a reconsenting process that included how we were going to disguise them, included showing them the footage that they're in so we could see everything else in the frame, and they could see everything they were saying, and they could do security reviews. And we brought in security teams to do outside security reviews. So all of that was part of this gaining of trust.
Thank you. For Ron and Elyse, you both have made ensemble character films. You know, you've made these, it's like the individual characters together tell a story of a body. So I wanted to talk with you about your subjects and how did you cast, how did you decide who, and was there resistance, and how did you overcome that? And what did, I think Ramona and David have pointed to this notion of that the characters actually start to want something from the film. They start to, and as Ramona said, like they start to embed as story producers in a way. They start to, you know, they want something to happen with this movie. They get really sophisticated about story. How did you cast and how did you put together that ensemble so that it told the story of this body?
Elyse?
So the first case, we basically went where the fight was. The vision was we're going to be in the ACLU national office, which is in downtown Manhattan. We're going to be with our cameras, and we're going to follow the lawyers in their civil rights battle against the Trump administration. We were going to find out where the big cases were. And the first big case was Lee Gouldern's case, fighting the Muslim ban. So we were with Lee, and while we were with Lee, and I would be with Lee, and then I remember the first time, you know, Trump tweeted that he was going to kick trans people out of the military, and ACLU was going to respond, and literally Chase Strangio and Josh Block are down the corner from Lee, and I'm like, "What are you guys doing?" And they're like, "Okay, we're fighting them." So I'm like, "Can I follow you?" So I was just like knocking down the doors of every ACLU lawyer asking if I could follow. And we didn't know which would be the case that would have a full arc of a story or would go places. You know, we thought maybe the Muslim ban would be this big Supreme Court case, but it ended up really that Lee started following family separation. So we just went with each story, and we were lucky that we found, you know, the lawyers doing it were these, you know, quirky, funny, eccentric people you want to be with, people you want to follow, characters. And you're funny about the story producing. You know, these are lawyers, and they're used to telling stories, so they all feel like they're so smart and they know how to tell movies, especially Lee. And some of them are really, and they're like, "Oh, you're going to include this, or how about that in the movie?" But Lee would always like, I love him to death, but he would always be like, so I'm at this restaurant. It's really great. I just ran into like a famous movie actor. You got to come down and film me with him. Like, no, that's not going to work. Like, that's not the kind of story I want. So it was, because they are used to telling stories. Sometimes they definitely felt like they know how to make this movie, and that was fun and also helpful too, because I think they know how to talk to an audience and be authentic, and that helped in telling the story.
Well, it's interesting to say you went to where the fight was, because as soon as you said it, I thought about it a little bit, and in an odd way, that's what we did too. Once we went there, and I was familiar face for them. That was good, helpful. Still, some people not interested and really sick already of cameras and people with them, with those cameras. But a lot of people were interested, and a lot of people really it was cathartic to not just a soundbite, but to show us their cell phone footage, which we wound up really using in the movie, a body cam footage of what it was to actually survive that event. And our Gladys Murphy and Mickey Milmore, our editors, just did an unbelievable job. It was first they were just assembling all of their footage. I knew I wanted to use it somewhere just to offer audiences reference, an understanding, a connection to what they'd all been through. How
did you decide who to cast? Because you have
that was the part about going where the fight was. So immediately we the first couple of times that I was there, and as we met people, they shared their footage and so forth. But we also started hearing about town events, the memorial, a urgent town meeting, the Christmas tree lighting, which they weren't sure was going to happen. And I kept saying, let's go to those. Let's cover those things and just see who shows up.
Who keeps coming back to who's leading.
And you know what? They were the ones that was the fight. The fight was to hang on to some hope, this belief that the town could come back. And we did start to find the people who largely turned out to be, our cast, but it was a very wide net to begin with. And some of it had to do with whether they even stayed. There were people who thought they were going to stay and wanted by all means, but were gone in no time. There were some fascinating people, and it broke our hearts because who just left so fast, and we really wanted to follow them, and they didn't even leave any trace. We couldn't even find them. So it was a fascinating process, and we started narrowing it down around 6 months into our shooting, and we had some very emotional footage. We saw the beginnings of some characteristics, some personalities, some conflicts, some struggle, and so forth. Some of the bigger dramatic turns had not occurred yet, but we certainly understood the struggle, the sort of shocking degree of bureaucracy that people had to face that just made them feel worse. Again, these are people who don't want to ask for help. I mean, they're the last person in the world who wants to accept help. And yet they're thrown into this paradoxical circumstance where suddenly they really need it. We never wanted to get on a soapbox about that or frame it particularly. But, if you're watching and paying attention, you're going to see that they suddenly have a very different relationship with, FEMA or the federal government or the state government.
When you lose your power, when you become vulnerable, how do you handle it when you've never had that experience?
And you've prided yourself on not wanting it, but all that said, about halfway through, this gets back to Kirsten again. About halfway through the movie, we got a lot of this emotional stuff, and so we gathered up. We're in New York. We're looking at everything, just the buckets and following the storylines and so forth. And we can see that cutting together this footage is going to be a great opening. And so we kind of almost feel like we have this amazing cinematic and opening, which gave a real personal connection to what everybody had been through. So all that's great. It's going along, and I'm looking around. And, I'm looking at Zan, and I'm looking at Liz, and I'm Justin, Sarah. They seem really happy, and everybody's really kind of upbeat. And I said, people, do we have a movie? Is there a story taking shape here? And they looked at me like I was such a little clown. I mean, it was just the most adorable little smirk of get used to it, Ron. It's going to be fine. It reveals itself eventually.
Well, I'm going to move to the others. the four of you where your main character was your collaborator. Can you believe this? We only have like 10 or 15 minutes left, which is why I'm like,
oh my God.
which is why I'm rushing. I wish
Uh-huh,
I had 5 hours. So forgive me. So I just want to talk with Dawn and Liz, Kirsten, about yours is sort of, I mean, your collaborator wasn't alive, but his wife and daughter were. And so I want to talk with you about what was it? What did it mean? Where were the opportunities and obstacles actually of working with as a creative collaborator with your subject? It had, yeah.
Like Ramona was saying, I think you become friends with your subject eventually, and it took a while for the family to actually be part of the project. And I should say they had no editorial control or anything. Shannon actually only saw the final cut of the film like a week before it broadcast, and then Linda, Bruce's widow, only saw it when it broadcast. But it's about that relationship building, that trust, right? And at first they were like, oh, another Bruce Lee documentary. There have been like 10 or 20. And I had a very specific lens and perspective of being an Asian American. And there has, surprisingly and unsurprisingly, there's never been a feature-length documentary about Bruce Lee directed by an Asian American. And I think that helped them understand my point of view more. And it helped guide sort of my thesis in the film. But, when I was making the film, I knew that they would have to be involved somehow just because they own the archive, and I wanted to tell a story that was very personal and intimate to Bruce Lee's life. And if you don't have the family involved, then it's sort of a tricky thing to do. And it was just, again, building that trust over time and kind of being relentless and sort of wanting to make the film, because I wanted to tell the story in my point of view and not talk about Bruce Lee in sort of the past tense. I always wanted us to kind of live in the moment that Bruce Lee was living in, because I think a lot of people forget, and it's funny to say this, that Bruce Lee was Asian American. In many ways, he like transcends his race because he's this global cultural icon, right? And no, like being an Asian American in 1960s Hollywood was surely very difficult. I mean, it's difficult enough to be Asian American today, right? And so I wanted to really understand the context of the world he was living in, and being able to like understand that context. And I wanted to also talk about sort of the larger scope of Asian American history and sort of kind of feed that into the dessert of Bruce Lee, and the vegetables would be the Bruce, Asian American history. Because I think for me, it's important that we have heroes that look like us, right? And I mean, I touched on this earlier, but especially now, and it's Bruce Lee's story might not seem relevant, but there was a UN report just this week that the one who shall not be named, his sort of use of Kung Flu and the China virus and the Wuhan virus has created so much animosity towards Asian Americans and Asians, right? And that just validates these stereotypes, these negative portrayals, this idea that we're not American, right? That we don't belong here. And so for me, it's important that we create we remind ourselves who our heroes are and what they did and what they stand for. I mean, I think about, there's a sort of like relationship actually, at least to your film, because I remember at Sundance, my producer was telling me like, oh, all these ACLU people want tickets to Be Water because they love Bruce Lee and he was such an inspiration to them. And, there's connective tissue, right? When we tell these stories about who our heroes are.
I think Lee, all he did was want to get into your film, and then he got lost, and then someone got him in.
Exactly. So
all of you guys do that in a way. You're all bringing into the light either an emotional process, a hero that we literally would never see in the mainstream media. We would never see it in the news. It's like you're this great humanizing mechanism that shows the complexity of these characters and our processes as humans. Thank you, Bao. I'm gonna move along and praying that we can come back around to everybody once more, but we may not be able to, so I'm gonna move along. Liz, you want to talk about, Liz and Don and Kirsten, whoever wants to, you want to talk about what it was like to like for Liz and Don, what was it like to collaborate with Pete and with Stacy? And I imagine, that it's like your film is your subject, but it seems that they also were creating it with you. Don, when you structure your film around Pete's kind of his talk that he gives as a way, I think as a kind of limiting, as a way to limit in a way, because you have 2 million photographs and you sort of choose to kind of go down that path with him. And I know that also his presence in public with his, his feed and his following in the last 3-4 years of coming forward as a political voice. I'm sure he was very invested in this with you.
He was, but we definitely had some challenges. One, which everyone will recognize, is I wanted to tell, so, I'm coming out of making a movie about John Lewis, and John Lewis is, kind of animating life principle was, if you see something that's wrong, speak up.
Yeah.
And so, that is what Pete was doing in his 60s, but Pete was very much used to controlling the action, and the big thing with him is he was like, you don't need to know anything about me. It's just about the pictures. And I really wanted to tell the story of what motivated this man in his 60s to stop being the fly on the wall and to be the person in the room, like yelling for attention and giving an opinion. So, so that was also like, he had very, he got death threats. President Obama got a lot of death threats. He was with President Obama every single day for 8 years. Like, he literally took 3 days off. I think one of the other things that was interesting that, I kept kind of pressing on him was, like a lot of people who are in the proximity of a different minority, he started to actually have the perspective, even though President Obama has a little bit of the Bruce Lee transcending race, in a lot of ways he does not. And Pete was really there for all of the racial animosity that was directed at President Obama. And he became, it's kind of like when a white person adopts a child of color and all of a sudden they get it, like the physical danger. And Pete became just outraged on behalf of President Obama. And I think that outrage in part also really motivated him to, to speak up when he left the White House. But he was quite worried for his safety. He didn't want to talk about his life. He was like kind of like blocking me at every turn about telling anything about him. And so that was the main challenge. But then, just as Ramona is saying, he started to get it. He started to, and then he was like, oh, well, you should come with me here. You should come with me here. And then COVID hit and we had to like finish in the COVID. So that was kind of the challenge of that. But he did not see the movie. We kind of narrowed it down to like several thousand pictures and then said, okay, Pete, so basically what I did is chose themes like leadership, empathy, compassion, crisis, and then pick some photos to tell those stories. And then we went to him and he was like, oh, well, if you like this, you'll love, these 57 photos also.
Got it. And he remembered them out of his head. He
has like this insane memory, like literally, and that's why his shade is so popular, because he can literally have like recall. He can find the picture. So that part was really fun. Like just sometimes we would play like Stump Pete. We're like, do you have any pictures of Obama on one foot? Like we would just like make shit up, just really particular about his photos. But that was fun.
It's really delicious to watch your movie, because at first you think, oh yeah, this is going to be a review of the White House presidency. And then in watching it, so much else comes forward of what it really is about. And it's really what you said about sort of the importance, the power of bearing witness, photographer as storyteller, record, and then the dignity of the office itself. And with this film and with the John Lewis film, I felt like it feels like what you're showing us is a juxtaposition, a contrast to what we have with both films. And in that sense, it's rather than naming, delving into the problems we are facing right now, you're showing us another way, another light.
Yeah, and I think it was, the idea was, I think we've taken for granted the idea of ethics and compassion as leadership qualities. And, for Pete, I could not believe, I was celebrating footage of President Reagan, who I went and protested pretty much every word out of President Reagan's mouth, like AIDS crisis, ketchup is a vegetable, wars, I could go on and on and on, the environment. And yet Pete did point out he had empathy. I think his policies were sorely misguided, but he was not a monster.
Kind of like what Bao said, it's like we need reflections of good leadership, of empathy out there instead of what we've been fed by him who shall not be named over this last 4 years. So Liz, and Kirsten, I'll end with you with your delicious smoothie. But Liz, so you worked with Stacey. It was sort of Stacey sort of generated the idea, I think, in parallel with you thinking about, and Lisa thinking about some of the same issues. How did you guys come together and come to a shared vision of what you wanted to do? And what were the challenges of working with your subject on a collaborative level?
Well, I can be kind of quick because it's basically what Dawn said, which was at Stacey. So I can give Kirsten more time because basically Stacey was like, this is not the Stacey Abrams film. And, it's not about me and it can't be about me. And, and Lisa and I were always like, but it's just a little bit about you, and so finally we knew she was writing a memoir and finally we convinced her to share some of her pages with us.
Perfect.
And, she had these great stories in there and we were like, okay, so we're going to ask you about these 5 stories. And, and then of course we threw in 5 others. And then she was during the interview, she was just like, what are you guys doing? It was really, it was that thing. And Lisa and I were, the film is of course, it's about our much larger shared history. And then when Stacey saw finally a rough cut, she was like, okay, I get it. You guys, you know what you're doing. So it did work out. And we got all the family photos we'd been requesting that she hadn't shared with us. And, all those things happened. So it was a very similar trajectory to Dawn with Pete. And
she was really important because you were telling us an historical story with three phases of history: the present, 65, and then right after slavery during Reconstruction, right? And so you needed her story to place us, to connect those things in the present with your history, right?
Yeah. Well, the good news is that it's the past is prologue, right? From an editing point of view, it was delicious because you talk about 1890 and the Mississippi Plan and you talk about felon disenfranchisement. Oh, that's going on today. So from an editing point of view, making the connections between past and present was not as hard as it is sometimes, right? Because we've been doing the same things all the time. It's just Black and brown Americans. It's just a different, it's like I said, the monster just has, it's the many-headed monster, and he just pushes over to the other head that had been underwater for a little while. So,
And all of your characters come to understand that actually what seems like their personal story at the beginning actually is not. It's something much bigger. They're carrying something much bigger in their personal stories.
Yeah, and look, Stacey is certainly well aware of what it means to, and there's something fundamentally hopeful about Stacey's story. Obviously, what happened in 2018 in Georgia is, very troubling for democracy. But then still you look at the story of Stacey's grandmother and her, absolute fear of going to the polls in 20 days after the Voting Rights Act had passed, and fear for her bodily harm versus her granddaughter being able to run for governor. Now her granddaughter, and I'm not, of course, I'm not trying to paint a pretty picture here, but we also do have to hold on to the fact that she's a hopeful figure. Look, I'm really excited about what's happening in Georgia right now. and it does give me a lot of hope. So it's been wonderful to, be a little bit on the journey with her, which is a hopeful journey.
Mm-hmm. At least there's some kind of dialectic going on with history instead of just stasis, absolute stasis. Yeah. Thank you for pointing it out. That's really helpful. Yeah. Okay, so Kirsten, will you I'm so glad can you just wrap up all these threads and just put them all together into one thing?
I'm actually going to do it.
Okay.
So first, I'm going to tell you, my dad always said, if the eyes are dry, the organs cry. So, we need to experience emotionally the moment we are in. We are in a profound moment in history right now. An election is upon us, right? Lisa Cortez's film urges us to get out there and vote. Elise's film urges us to get out there and fight. Dawn always urges us to get out there and fight. Ramona always urges us to get out there and fight. David does too, right? And Ron is talking about the apocalypse that's coming. It's not just the election, right? That we are in this moment in history in which we're living.
Bow is humanizing.
Wait, I'm not done. I'm not done. I got bow. I'm wrapping with bow. But so, we are always as humans in the midst of an existential threat for our own lives, the lives of loved ones, the lives of people we don't know, right? Mm-hmm. The stakes are always really high being human. And, we fight to have legacies that are worth having, like John Lewis, the people that so many people will never know their names, like in David's film, like in Ron's film. People know certain names. People know the name of Bruce Lee, but they do not know their inner struggles, and they don't know the fight of the many monsters of systems that crush people and don't allow them to be visible, right? And we, as filmmakers, we're trying to use these tools, the tools that sound gives us, image gives us, people's eyes give us, to get through to each other. But, for me, I have this scene in heaven where everybody's in heaven, and Bruce Lee's in my heaven bow. I don't know if you saw my film yet, but Bruce Lee is there, and Billie Holiday is there, and Frida Kahlo is there, and Buster Keaton is there, and they're all artists who sort of put their bodies on the line in search of transforming their pain into art that helps the rest of us survive. So, we're all of us trying to work with this craft to communicate to each other. And long may we all live. And those are the people who have died in the films we have made. Long may they live through our films, including Dick Johnson. I'm done. I'm out, Caroline. You can take it away.
Well, I just want to reflect back to you that was so beautiful. Thank you. You really did it. You really did interweave all the threads. I think maybe we could call all of this the fight, potentially. But I also think, for Kirsten, your movie is so moving because it keeps putting me back in the present of what you're experiencing in the frame as the filmmaker, as the daughter, of trying to of challenging yourself to be in the moment with your father while you have him. And I'm dying to have a much longer conversation with you about your choices, how you the ways that you decide that you create that experience for us, the viewer. It is almost like you said, an existential threat. It is almost like a Waiting for Godot movie. We keep going back to the moment where he dies. We're waiting. We keep being there. We're Sisyphus, but
that's hilarious. I'd love to see this movie. It's Sisyphus and Waiting for Godot. I'm running to see it.
But it's absurd and fun too, and full of love. But it is Buster Keaton too. But
it is Buster Keaton too.
Buster Keaton too. But the point is that your movie's about time, but it's it keeps bringing us back into the present by rewinding and taking us to the moment of death again and again and again. And you're reminding us to be present with the ones we love and tell them. So, and in a way, voting right now is that writ large on a national level, is let's be in this present moment together and let's express our love by voting. So I thank you for that. Thanks everybody. I'm going to try to find some questions that will somehow mirror all the ideas and also mirror Kirsten's.
While you're searching for questions, I just want to say I teased one thing at the beginning, and I just want to say it.
Yes, please.
Well, I'm on the board of Jacob Burns Film Center, and one of the founders, which is, a great. That's not why I didn't want to plug them, but they're great. Jonathan Demi was one of the founders, and one day on a board meeting, I said he was a great Academy Award-winning director, but also a wonderful documentarian and loved documentaries. And I said, I'm a little terrified. I'm in awe. I'm a little humbled by documentaries, and you bridge them. And he put his hand on my shoulder and just said, just do it, man. And if anybody knows Jonathan, you just know how much love he could give in just a moment and a touch, and how much support and energy. And it was really one of the great gifts. He's not with us anymore. We all miss him. But and by the way, what a great group you all are. And the other fantastic thing is that audiences have finally caught up with documentarians and the great stories that they have to tell and what it can mean. And so congrats to all of you. But I just wanted to mention Jonathan.
Just do it. All right. It's funny. A lot of these questions we've kind of touched on. A lot of people are asking for like general questions, and we only have about 4 minutes. But if anyone feels moved about sort of, well, actually, I have a question, which is, what from this moment that you've all been through with COVID, with this last 4 years, with making this last film, for Dawn making these 2 films in the course of 1 year, these films that are so deeply important to all of you and really in the fabric of who you are, what will come next for you? How have you been changed or been shaped by this past year and this movie that you've just completed and that's just now out for audiences? And what will come next? Has something shifted for you in how you're looking at documentary filmmaking? If that's not relevant, I can find another question, but.
That's a big question for 3 minutes.
Yeah, it is.
And should answer it in all of our voice.
Exactly. Maybe it's not relevant. Maybe you just keep doing what you're
doing. Well, I think, something that, like Kirsten and maybe just Kirsten, my partner is also in the documentary film work, in the filmmaking world. And, one of the things we talk about sometimes is, and now I'm just going super partisan, but God, if Trump wins, can we keep making films? It feels like, of course you have to, and you do the fun, but there's something that's so, we've all been doing this, right? And it's and change is so necessary, and it's so structural, and it's just a scary thought. And of course, we'll go on and we'll pick up and do what we have to do, and I know you all will too. But it's filmmaking. It's a question, and filmmaking is I think documentary filmmaking is an essential part of democracy, right? And it's what role does it have as we see that dying? I guess it has an even more essential role. I'm just musing right now, but it's certainly it's a big moment, as Kirsten, as all of us have been talking about.
Yeah.
Where the forces of evil will be, really shored up, and it's terrifying. And I of course I think a lot about more vulnerable populations, and it's an incredible challenge, and something I'm thinking about.
I have a very quick question. Ramona and David, you two would just, it blows my mind to imagine walking into those environments and actually making a film, and so the courage of that. But I'm also just, so what does it look like to be trying to tell a story in an environment like that? And are your subjects doing okay?
And I just want to make sure Dawn also has a moment, because she raised her hand. So
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. No, that's okay. Ramona and David, and then Dawn, and then we'll stop.
Okay, so to answer your question first, it occurred to me what this moment is about reimagining, right? And there's so much destruction around us, but rebuilding, and reimagining what we can make of this moment moving forward. So in a little way, it's such an existential moment for all of us, but can you imagine the possibilities of recreation and reimagining? how we can make films. And the more, we shouldn't stop making films. It's a moment that we should really a lot of people should make films. We should continue. But how to, it was a dangerous place. I mean, not a dangerous moment for my character, but at some point, like Maria says, you have to touch it. You have to touch your fear. And when you touch your fear, it doesn't have as much power over you. So that's how I did it. I said, let's embrace it and let's go move forward. And that's how I could make that film, really. And Maria's she is under lockdown in the Philippines, and lockdown in the Philippines is very strict lockdown. You cannot move. There's curfew. You will be arrested if you leave your apartment because of COVID. And she has 8 cases against her. She has 1 verdict. She can go to jail for 6 years and another verdict coming down the pike, maybe the end of the year. She's disallowed to travel. So she's basically locked in her apartment, but is still able to speak. And she's speaking out and still speaking out loudly and is still very optimistic, which I always say is her superpower.
Amazing.
It's so good to hear. I think a lot of us understand what it's like to be locked in our apartments these days. Unfortunately.
But you won't be shot if you leave. So. Yeah. I mean, most of us won't be.
Yeah, no. And like your subjects, mine are in no safer place today than they were a year ago when I stopped filming. And we brought some of them to some of our festivals when festivals were still offline before the arrival of the coronavirus. And we had numerous threats that were taken seriously. And so we were kind of relieved in a way that that the film festivals were no longer giving us those opportunities to get together that way because of the dangers that arose out of that. So we're still in a still too many question marks around the future for the folks in the film, and we're hoping that the film will capture the kind of political urgency and attention that's going to be necessary to put an end to this problem there. And I think, as Liz was saying earlier, that documentary films are important for democracy. I think they're also an incredible, unmatched tool for these times. And I'm just so proud to be able to try and work in that medium alongside you all to try to answer questions like, what the hell is this world going to look like now after COVID?
I was going to say, Caroline, in response to your question about has anything changed, one of the great things that is happening in documentary is the audience has found us. And so there's more attention, which creates more opportunity. Budgets are getting slightly bigger. It's easier to get some things off the ground, some things. And so I think what has changed is remembering, the origin story of our craft, and in deciding about the choice of projects, thinking really hard about not chasing the shiny object and making sure you have a film with something to say. Yeah. And that does not mean I have to be as brave as Ramona and go to the Philippines, because I'm not. It could mean being as creative as KJ and saying, what can nonfiction tell us about ourselves? Because that is really where we find this human connection that we are so deeply missing. So I think, like, for me, it's evaluating the, really taking, a beat to take care with the choice of it takes us a couple of years to make these, at least, right? At
least
take care with that privilege. That's what I keep saying to myself, choose wisely.
Thank you so much. We're
Can I say one?
Yes, stop. And then we have to end.
Just in the spirit of this panel and what everyone's saying, and just what can come out of this, year, what can come out of 2020. This is something, I'm paraphrasing something Chi-Wei Yang said from the Ford Foundation a couple of weeks ago. And it's just we all have different past, we all are living a different present, but the one thing that we do share is the future. And that's something that really stuck to me. And I hope it's something I think about when I think about what we can do together and kind of the shared humanity of everything.
What a beautiful place to end. You guys are extraordinary. Thank you so much. What a privilege to talk with all of you. And we'll talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Pleasure.